Alrighty, so quick recap of where we have been, and I'll try this week to hit my slides better than I have the last 2 weeks. Through Joseph, God has provided bountifully for his people. So we saw last week Joseph brings his family down into Egypt, and he doesn't just let them skid by where they have just barely enough to survive. He provides them with a place to live that's the best in the land, and he's giving them more than they could possibly need. And we saw that God is just overflowing with blessings toward his people. We also see that Jacob and his sons have come to live in Egypt, but this is temporary because we keep on seeing these callbacks and these anticipations of the Exodus and recognizing there is still a promise out there that they are going to live in Canaan. God is going to give the land of Canaan to his people. And so even though Jacob and his sons have come down and are living in Egypt now, we know that this is not going to last forever, even though we're going to end in Egypt today at the end of Genesis. Today we're going to go all the way chapter 48 through 50. Some people cut off the Joseph narrative at the end of 47, and they say this is kind of a tagline that is not necessarily the Joseph narrative. I think the Joseph narrative is just part of the big picture of Genesis. So whether you call this part of the Joseph narrative or not, all of it has been the sons of Jacob narrative. And so with all of it being the sons of Jacob narrative, this is definitely squarely in the center of the sons of Jacob narrative. So we're going to see Jacob now future telling and talking about his sons and what is going to become of them and of their descendants. But let's start in chapter 48, where Jacob starts talking about Ephraim and Manasseh, who are Joseph's sons. So let's look in chapter 48, verse 1. It says, after this, Joseph, remember, they're all in Egypt now. Jacob is in Egypt. They've been living there for a long time. At this point, Jacob, all his sons, Joseph, they're all there. After this, Joseph was told, behold, your father is ill. So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, your son Joseph has come to you. Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So let's pause here for just a second. Right at the beginning, we see Jacob is actually on his deathbed now. Remember, before Jacob came down to Egypt, he was pretty done with his life. He thought, I'm not going to survive maybe even a trip down to Egypt. He was not optimistic about how much life he has left. But now he's lived 17 years since then. So he came down and he was able to see Joseph. He said, at last I can die. This is great. I've seen Joseph. We're good. And then he lives for another 17 years. But now he's actually fallen ill. He is actually on his deathbed going to die. And what Jacob does talking to Joseph and to Joseph's sons is he recalls the promises of God. He recalls the promises of God. And he talks about when God appeared to Jacob, which happens multiple times in the Bible. If you look back at Genesis 28, verse 13, is the first time that God appears to Jacob. He comes to him in Genesis 28, 13, when Jacob leaves and he goes to Beersheba, he goes to toward Haran, and he comes to a certain place and stays there, and he dreams, and you hear about Jacob's ladder. This is where it is. He sees Jacob's ladder set on the earth, and the angels of God are ascending and descending, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. So God is making a promise there. Then you see in Genesis chapter 35, verse 6, Jacob comes to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who are with him, and there he builds an altar and calls the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself when he fled from his brother. So that's where you see that he has, God appeared to him there on that first time, and then he comes back to Luz and he builds an altar that is commemorating that. But recognize that when God appears to Jacob in the first place, Jacob is fleeing from his brother Esau. So Jacob and Esau have this theme that we have seen through the whole book of Genesis. There's this fraternal strife, right? There's this brotherly conflict that happens between all these different brothers. And here when God first appears to Jacob, it's because of that conflict that Jacob is fleeing from Esau. And so now, after all of this story of brotherly conflict in the story of the sons of Jacob, now Jacob comes and he brings back up this time that God appeared to him in the midst of brotherly conflict. Now God has brought him through that brotherly conflict. God has brought Joseph and his brothers through that brotherly conflict. And now Jacob is calling back those promises that God gave to him. And the promises were he was going to make him fruitful and multiply him. So remember we talked last week about that language, go be fruitful and multiply. That's a directive that's given to Adam and Eve at the very beginning. So beginning of Genesis, human beings are supposed to be fruitful and multiply. They mess up, they fail. We have the flood and Noah. It's sort of a reset. And God says to Noah, be fruitful and multiply. And so there's, again, this directive to humanity to be fruitful and multiply. And then God gives this promise later on to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they are going to be fruitful and multiply. And now, through Joseph, it is possible for them to be fruitful and multiply because they have been preserved through this famine. So you see these themes in Genesis start to be tied up through the life of Joseph here. And that is part of the promise that Jacob brings up here. He's bringing about the fulfillment of the commissions to Adam and to Noah. And then the other thing is, I am going to give this land to your offspring. He tells Jacob there in chapter 26, this is going to happen. Your family will own this land. And so again, as Joseph calls back this promise, it's a foreshadowing here of the Exodus. You are not going to stay in Egypt forever. And it's a promise that going to Egypt is not disobedient in this situation, because remember, God appears to Jacob as he's going down to Egypt, and he says, go, you're good, you can go down to Egypt, your descendants are going to come up after you. So then in verses 5 and 6, Jacob claims, oh, I skipped it. Oh, we're good. Okay. Jacob claims Manasseh and Ephraim as his own children. So these are the sons of Joseph that Joseph had in Egypt. And what Jacob is doing is he is extending the blessing of God, that the way that God has blessed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now he is extending that to Ephraim and Manasseh, which is interesting. We're going to see him giving his blessings to all of his sons, but it's like he's giving a double portion of blessing to Joseph. He's not just giving this blessing to Joseph, but he's going to his sons and he's counting them as his own. He is blessing both Ephraim and Manasseh as his own children. And one commentator said, as I was reading on this, that Jacob is demonstrating gratitude to Joseph, and in exalting his sons to the level of Jacob's own sons, in a way he's exalting Joseph in a level to himself. So as he exalts his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph is being held up as this patriarch along the lines of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph is very much the way that this is pictured in the story here. Then in verse 7, he brings up the death of Rachel, which is interesting. It looks a little bit out of place here, but I think it's possible that Jacob is looking at Ephraim and Manasseh as sons that he should have had through Rachel. Rachel was the woman that he initially loved. Rachel was the wife that he wanted that he wanted in the first place. And he has Joseph and he has Benjamin, and then she dies in childbirth with Benjamin. I think that he's looking at Ephraim and Manasseh as this is what could have been through Rachel. This is my offspring coming through Rachel. Joseph, the name Joseph, whenever Joseph is born, Rachel says, "May the Lord add another son to me." Joseph comes from the root of the word to add, to add to. And so this idea of sons being added to Jacob through Joseph makes a lot of sense with the overall narrative of the story. So then he goes on and says, when Israel saw, verse 8, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near to him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So here, Jacob is coming to bless Joseph's sons as if they're his own sons. And remember, Jacob was fleeing from Esau whenever God appeared to him. But why was he fleeing from Esau back in chapter 26 whenever God, or 28 when God appeared to him? He stole his brother's blessing, right? He was the younger son who should not have gotten the blessing, and he tricked his father into giving the blessing to the younger son. Why was he able to trick his father? Eyesight. His father had grown dim of seeing. He couldn't see that it was Jacob instead of Esau. And so Jacob's fleeing from Esau whenever God appears to him. And it's a very similar situation here. It describes the eyes of Israel are dim with age, and he's now going to bless the younger son instead of the older son. But this time it's not because he's mistaken about who they are. It's because he's chosen, this is how I'm going to do this. So it's not just the younger brother Joseph here receiving the blessing of Jacob, but also the sons of this younger brother. And then we're going to see the flip of the younger brother receiving the greater blessing between Ephraim and Manasseh. So Joseph situates the boys for blessing with the older on the right and the younger on the left, but Jacob has a different idea. Verse 15. He blessed Joseph, saying, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life, long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, and let the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." When Joseph saw his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you, and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow." So we see this blessing that Jacob gives. it's interesting. If you look in verse 15, when he brings this blessing, it says, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked." So his fathers Abraham and Isaac are walking before God. But then he describes God as his shepherd, as if that God is now going before me. He's the one that they walked before, but that God is now going before me and guiding me and my family. And one day he's going to guide us up out of Egypt. This is a blessing that is going to the sons of Jacob in general, but even more to Ephraim and Manasseh. So he's describing a God who is with his people. He's going ahead of them. He's guiding them. And he's extending this, when he says that they are going to grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth, he's extending this blessing of be fruitful and multiply to Ephraim and Manasseh. So then what he does is he turns to the rest of his sons in chapter 49. He calls his sons and he says, "Gather together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come." And I keep on forgetting to push these things. The blessing prefers this. Yep, we're good. Okay, so I'm going to take the blessings of each of his sons and talk about what we know from these blessings and how they have actually played themselves out. It says in the end of chapter 49, this is how he blessed them and the blessing that he gave to them. But a lot of these blessings don't really seem like blessings. A lot of these blessings seem a little bit more like curses. But what Jacob is doing here is he is giving really prophetic news about what is going to happen among the brothers. So he says that I may tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. And they are strikingly accurate. Liberal scholars look at this and they say, yep, this is definitely written later because this was like so on point in his future telling about the tribes of Israel. But it really is just that it was an inspired future telling from God about what was going to happen. The other thing about this that you should recognize is this turns into Hebrew poetry here. So basically all of chapter 49 is Hebrew poetry. And Hebrew poetry, especially in the Pentateuch, gets really complicated. It's difficult. So whenever you read Hebrew poetry in like Genesis through Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, all of the, I know that was out of order, I'm sorry. I always forget Numbers in there. Whenever you read that, a lot of the time it has old vocabulary that is older than the rest of the text in those 5 books. And also poetry just breaks all the rules in Hebrew. So it is really difficult to read. I did a study on Deuteronomy in seminary and just did an extended independent study in the Hebrew language on Deuteronomy. And I was translating through Deuteronomy, and I felt like I knew Hebrew. It was awesome. It was like I was on a roll. I was translating, and then I hit this chapter, and I had no idea what it was saying, and I just screeched to a halt. None of it made sense. All of it was like these weird words I had never heard. The tenses of the verbs were completely different. It just didn't make sense, and it was because I had run into poetry. It's just this really, really tricky thing in the Pentateuch. And so some of these, we read them in English, and it's like, what is that talking about? And you read it in Hebrew, and it's even more. What is that talking about? But there are people who are much smarter than me, fortunately, who are working through these things. Sometimes you'll see in your footnotes in your Bible, they'll give an alternate possible translation in there. And sometimes it looks completely different. Like, how could this be talking about a donkey instead of a vine? But it is because this is just really tricky and difficult to translate. The vocabulary is weird. Remember, in Hebrew, there's no spaces between words. There's no vowels written in it. It's just letters on letters on letters on letters. And so sometimes the words could be divided in a little bit different way, and it could say something a little bit different. But ultimately, the meaning and the essential meaning of the text is the scholars have gotten really good at pulling that out. But just to say, there's a few of these that we don't really know exactly what it means because that's tricky. Also, when you hit Hebrew poetry, it's not all meant to be taken 100% like exactly literally. It's all to be taken truthfully, and that is, it is telling the truth. But some of it is images of that are describing what is happening. So we come to Reuben first in verses 3 and 4. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. So Reuben is the firstborn, but Reuben is not going to get the firstborn blessings. And we've seen this throughout the Joseph narrative, that Reuben, we know he's the firstborn, but he just sometimes doesn't seem to be treated that way. And Jacob never really seems to give him that spot. And no, he's from Leah. He is the firstborn from Leah. So Reuben, the reason here is given, it's from back in chapter 35. Reuben actually sleeps with Bilhah, who was Rachel's servant, who was given to Jacob to have children on behalf of Rachel. So Reuben is a child of Leah, but he goes to Bilhah, who was also a concubine of his father. And so that gives an explanation for the negative or even just absent way that Jacob talks about Reuben throughout the narrative. And it's interesting here, the tribe of Reuben really doesn't show up much later on in the rest of the narrative of the Bible. The tribe of Reuben ends up settling east of the Jordan. So whenever, I meant to put a map in here, but if you look in the back of your Bible, you probably have a map there. If you look at where the tribes of Israel have settled, there's a few that as they go up, before they cross the Jordan, there's a few that say, we just want to take this land. We don't want to go across the Jordan into Canaan. We want to keep this land on the other side of the Jordan. And Reuben is one of those. And ultimately, Reuben kind of gets a little mixed up into the other tribes that are east of the Jordan, and then you really just don't hear about him later on. There's some evidence that by the time of the exile, the tribe of Reuben is basically absorbed into the tribe of Gad, and it just talks about the tribe of Gad, and Reuben is just not there. So it very much comes true here that he doesn't have preeminence. He doesn't have this first order. He is basically removed from the inheritance of the promised land by his choice, by taking the land to the east of the Jordan River. Then it goes on to Simeon and Levi. Verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul not come into the counsel of let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Again, not super happy stuff, right? Like this is called a blessing here, but it doesn't seem like a blessing. If you look back at these are the next sons of Leah, so it's firstborn Reuben, then Simeon, then Levi. These are all sons of Leah. If you look back in chapter 34, because of the events of chapter 34, they are going to be divided in Israel, and their land is going to be scattered throughout Israel. Chapter 34, a sister of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, a daughter of Lehi, is raped by a man from a nearby group of people called Shechem. And Simeon and Levi are upset about that, which is good. You should be upset about that. But their solution to that is a very, very violent response where they find a way to trick the men of Shechem, and they end up going and they slaughter all of the men of Shechem, which ends up not just being like bad and unjust because they're going and slaughtering the people of Shechem, but that ends up making Jacob's family, what Jacob says, a stench in the eyes of the people of Canaan, and so it gives them a bad name with their neighbors around them. And so Jacob doesn't view this as a good thing that they have gone and they have done in response to what happened to their sister. So he says they'll be divided in Israel, and that's exactly what happens. Levi, the tribe of Levi, later on becomes the priestly tribe. This is the tribe where Moses and Aaron come from, and whenever they get to the land, if you look at the map of the tribes of Israel, there's not a Levi on there because they're priests. Their inheritance is the Lord, is what it says. They don't get an inheritance of land. They're scattered throughout as ministers to the Lord. Simeon, if you look at a map, usually it'll put a little circle in the middle of the tribe of Judah down in the south. But Simeon is basically dispersed in Judah. And later on in the history of Israel, you'll see the kingdom of Israel split into two. You'll see the northern tribes of Israel, which is the vast majority of the tribes, and then Judah and Benjamin split off to the south. Technically, Simeon's kind of spread within Judah there. Some of them go up with the northern tribes. Some of them stay down with Judah and Benjamin, but it basically just disappears. Simeon just is scattered and disappears. And so exactly what Jacob says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That is exactly what happens with Simeon and Levi. Any questions before we go to Judah? Yes. No, so this is before the law is given. This is well before the Exodus and Moses gives them the law. They were killing people from Shechem who were not descendants of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. Oh yeah, because of the circumcision in that story is simply deception. It wasn't the only reason they were having them circumcised was for the sake of killing them. I think that that had really little to do with the law. That absolutely was part of the covenant with Abraham there, but I don't think that the issue was them coming against covenant members. I think the issue was that they were slaughtering people who weren't guilty of the sin for which they were slaughtering them. So, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Okay, so then we come to Judah. Judah is the one that we see sort of treated as the firstborn in a lot of parts of the Joseph narrative. Verse 8, Judah, your brothers shall praise you, and your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. So here we see Judah emerge as the first one that's a really positive blessing, and this is good. Judah, again, he's still a son of Leah. He's after Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and he gets this longer blessing than anyone except for Joseph in this list of blessings. And it's a blessing that makes him the ruling tribe. It talks about things like his brothers bowing before him. There's a scepter and a ruler's staff that won't depart from him. To him shall be the obedience of the people. So this is pointing at Judah as the one through whom the kings of Israel is going to come. And that turns out to be what happens. Ultimately, David is from the tribe of Judah, and it's from the family of David that you have all of the kings of Judah stemming all the way down to in the New Testament where we see Jesus come as the son of David. And so Judah, all of this is very much prophecy that's pointing forward to kingship in Israel, which is a promise that was made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that there would be kings that would come from you. That's going to come through Judah. And ultimately, it's pointing us forward to Jesus, the King who would have a throne that would never end. Now, one day, like I said, the kingdom of Israel is going to be split. It's going to be split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom really it gets all mixed up with other people. It's taken by the Assyrians. They end up intermarrying with other people. They are really very much lost. The northern kingdom of Israel, all of these tribes in the northern kingdom, they're all mixed up and very much lose their identity. But the southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah. And Judah stays strong. And that's where, when you get into the New Testament and you have Judaism and you have the Jews, they are all coming from this tribe of Judah, and Benjamin's mixed in there as well. So very much Judah is the one that endures. And there's a lot of verbiage here about prosperity that is going to come from Judah. So there's interesting images like binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. What's that about? Why would you have a vine, a choice vine, where you got these great grapes and then you tie your donkey to it? What's the donkey going to do? He's going to eat all your grapes. Why would you do that? You would never tie your donkey to your choice vine. That's ridiculous, unless you are so prosperous that you are willing to tie up your donkey to the choice vine. Like that is just an overwhelming prosperity there. And why in the world would you wash your garments in wine? If you like that doesn't seem like a wise use of your resources, but this is an overwhelming prosperity that he has. I do think this is primarily pointing us to the prosperity of the people of Judah, but I also think that we would be remiss to not see a connection to Christ that would come from this. That yes, these pictures of wine and of the vine and everything are definitely pictures of prosperity, but they're also very similar to images that Jesus uses about himself in the New Testament. We see Jesus in the Lord's Supper say that this cup that would have held wine is representative of his blood that is poured out for us. And I think as we see this image of wine here coming and washing garments and his and being really bountifully poured out on behalf of people, that I think that is a picture that is pointing us forward to a descendant of Judah, where it is an anticipation of the ministry of Jesus, that his blood would be poured out on behalf of us. And you can look into some of the other images in this. The vine often in the Old Testament is pointing us towards the people of Israel, so it very well could make a connection there as well to Jesus' relationship with Israel. But ultimately, I do think that the primary initial meaning of this is about the prosperity of Judah. With a connection, there is a connection there to Jesus and the ministry that Jesus does have for us. So Judah, excuse me. Wow, I don't have water today. Oh, no, I'm good. Thank you. Judah with Benjamin endures when the rest of Israel is scattered, as I said. Any questions on Judah? Cool. Okay, so after him is Zebulun, which is weird because Zebulun is not the next son. Zebulun, it kind of skips out of order here. It should be Issachar as the next son of Leah. It skips to Zebulun. I read a bunch of commentaries. I don't know why. I'm sorry. I wish there was a super meaningful reason of why, but I couldn't find it. So, it does put Zebulun before Issachar, and it says, Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. One reason why it might, and this is purely speculation that none of the commentaries said, so take this as Will, the genius who knows everything, right? That's what Zebulun ends up being the place where Galilee is, and Nazareth in particular is there in the allotment that is given to Zebulun. So maybe it goes from Judah, where the Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah, who lived in Nazareth, which is the place of Zebulun. Maybe, I don't know, that's speculation, but that might be why they put him next. Who knows? Anyway, Zebulun ends up next to the Sea of Galilee, and he borders on the Phoenician territory to the northwest, which is where Sidon is, and this is where Nazareth would be. That body of water that the sea that he's going to dwell on is probably referring to the Sea of Galilee there. It doesn't border on the Mediterranean Sea there, so it's probably talking about the Sea of Galilee. Issachar after him. It says, Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. This is one of those that the translation is really questionable about what exactly this is saying. But it says, he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor. So the way the ESV takes this really seems to be this is a strong tribe, but that chooses to rest and to take it easy and ends up being enslaved because of that. Nothing in the Old Testament tells us that Issachar was ever enslaved to anyone. There's not anything that really points to that being a fact. There are other ways to translate it that make it less about being someone's slave and more about being a farmer, which would line up with how Issachar seems to go on. There's a lot of ambiguity there. We're not really sure exactly what that one means. Dan comes after that. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. Dan is really interesting. Dan is described as his judge. You do see later in the book of Judges, Samson is from the tribe of Dan. You also see some really questionable stuff happening in the book of Judges from the tribe of Dan. So it's not like an entirely positive promise here. But Dan ends up being the very northernmost tribe in Israel, and very much is kind of the northern hedge of defense for the people of Israel. And so this idea of being a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, anyone who wants to come from the north down into Israel has to go through Dan. And you see that through the history of Israel, that Dan is a defense, and Dan is a viper there that comes to fight against those who are coming into Israel from the north. So it's very possible that's what that is directing towards. There's a strange moment at the end of this that seems a little bit out of place, where it says, I wait for your salvation, O Lord. And that could point to the fact that Dan is very much salvation in many ways when the enemies of Israel come in from the north. It also could be a musical break here. Remember, this is poetry, and this is very close to the center of the big picture poem. So it very well could simply be a musical break there that says, I wait for your salvation, O Lord, where Jacob pauses and lifts up this praise to the Lord, the God of their salvation, and then moves on in this. But it could be connected to Dan and where he ends up there. He's the northern defense. He does, Samson, like I said, comes from him, and he's significant in the book of Judges. Then you come to three really quick ones that just don't get a lot of time. Sorry, Gad and Asher and Naphtali, but that's how it is. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Gad is one of the other tribes that settles east of the Jordan. And so Gad ends up constantly being attacked by people from the east. Gad, anyone who wants to come to the Jordan and attack Israel from the east, they got to go through Gad. And he is constantly having to fight against the Ammonites, the Moabites. He's constantly in turmoil. But Gad seems, in this, he shall raid at their heels. He's always in turmoil, but he always prevails. And Gad does seem to be a strong tribe throughout the time of Israel before the Assyrians come and actually take them over. But they're always dealing with some sort of attack. After him is Asher. Asher's food shall be rich. He shall yield royal delicacies. From this, we don't really know anything that comes of this, but Asher, the name, means blessed and happy, and it does seem like that very much comes into the blessing here, that it's just a blessed and happy tribe. We don't hear a whole lot of Asher after that. And then Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. Again, that's another one that's really tough to translate. Some people translate it really positively, like this is awesome, pretty offspring, good job. Some people interpret it a little bit more negatively. You see in the history of Naphtali some positive things and some negative things. You see in Judges, in the story of Deborah, there's some really positive things where they go to fight with Deborah and they're cast positively. There's also some negative things. They are one of the tribes that doesn't drive out all of the Canaanites whenever they go into the Promised Land. They're one of the tribes that ends up just not fulfilling what God has told them to do. You do see an interesting thing whenever they are when they're in the camp, when they're wandering in the wilderness, and they've got the tabernacle at the center of their camp, and all of the tribes are placed around the camp. Naphtali is stuck kind of behind another tribe close to the tabernacle as if they need to be defended from the outside from, I think it's Dan. It's Dan. They're sort of hidden behind Dan there. I don't, whether that's significant there or not, I don't know. But Naphtali, that's one that we're not entirely sure what comes out of that. So then after that, you come to Joseph. And as if the nice long blessing that he gave to Ephraim and Manasseh wasn't enough, he still wants to dote on his favorite son, Joseph. And so he gets Joseph the longest blessing here in this section. It says, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents. Up to the bounties of the everlasting hills, may they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. So you see this idea in Joseph of fruitfulness out of struggle. You see this attack against him, the archers bitterly attacking him. You know, this very much mirrors the life of Joseph. All sorts of stuff was set against him, and yet, verse 24, his bow remained unmoved. And so out of that comes great blessing and fruitfulness. And some of the translation there is a little bit tricky, but verses 23 to 24 very much look like the rest of Joseph's life. After Joseph, with Ephraim and Manasseh, what you see happen with those tribes, Manasseh is one of the largest landmass tribes. You don't hear a whole lot of their history of their people, but they get a huge chunk. They get some east of the Jordan and some west of the Jordan. Ephraim becomes a very significant tribe and is very... that you see Ephraim referenced all through the Old Testament as this significant kind of mainstay of the northern kingdom, and this is sometimes even their name is used in substitute for the northern kingdom. So very much that blessing of the younger Ephraim over Manasseh plays out in the history of Israel, that Ephraim is much more influential, they're much more important, even though Manasseh does seem to get more land at the beginning whenever they're allotted their land in Israel. Set apart in blessing. And then you come to Benjamin. Benjamin gets a little one at the end. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. Benjamin survives, but it's ugly. And that is very much what comes out of the story of Benjamin. Benjamin is really interesting. If you just want to do an interesting study through the whole Bible, find Benjamin and find the tribe, what's happening with the tribe of Benjamin. So you see him be this kind of crux of this brotherly tension in the Joseph narrative, where is Benjamin going to go? Is Benjamin not going to go? You get into the book of Judges. At the end of Judges, one of the most vile, terrible stories in Judges that shows just the extreme sinfulness of the people of Israel. It involves Benjamin, and Benjamin is almost completely wiped out. Benjamin's off the map. But then through this crazy thing in the end of the book of Judges. They survive. They keep going. Who comes from Benjamin? King Saul. King Saul's a Benjaminite, and that seems really great at first. Like, cool, we're going to have the king of Israel, and then Saul turns out to be a terrible person, and it doesn't work out for Benjamin, and they struggle. But then whenever the tribes divide, and you have the northern kingdom go off and worship false gods, and they end up being destroyed and basically lost, who goes with Judah? Benjamin goes with Judah. Benjamin's the only other tribe that really survives through all of that, where Benjamin and Judah are together in that big tribe of Judah. So it is really interesting just to follow the tribe of Benjamin and to see how that plays out throughout the Old Testament. He really does end up surviving, but he has to be a ravenous wolf devouring prey to make it through it. Interesting thing, one other person who is a Benjaminite is Paul the Apostle. Paul it says that he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and if you look at the ministry of Paul, it very much is like a ravenous wolf going after with the gospel. It's just interesting to follow him through the whole book. So Jacob gives burial instructions after this to be buried with his father and his grandfather, and then he dies, and we're going to look into that a little more getting into chapter 50, but it goes back to God's promise here at the end that he would bring him up out of Canaan, and serves as a foreshadowing of the Exodus. But before we jump into some conclusions in chapter 50, does anyone have any other questions on those tribes? My read on this is this section is mostly past telling. I think it's talking about what has happened. So Joseph's brothers were against him. Even people in Egypt were attacking him. Harassed him. Like, all of that was negative, and yet he was unmoved. His arms were made agile, metaphorically saying, like, the Lord gave him wisdom and preserved him through all of this. And then ultimately he ends up being really the shepherd that leads Israel down into Egypt, and is the one, kind of the rock on which all of Israel is built up. I do think there's significance for the future in that as well, because you do see Ephraim and Manasseh being attacked and yet surviving in a lot of ways. So I do think it has significance both directions, but I think that part is looking past tense. Another tricky thing about Hebrew poetry, though, is sometimes it is written in past tense, but it's actually read in the future tense. Why? I don't know, but that's just how it works. But that's how I read that. Any other questions? Okay, so chapter 50. In chapter 50, we start off with Jacob being buried in Canaan as a foreshadowing of the Exodus. So in end of chapter 49, verse 33, when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. So Jacob really receives the mourning of Egyptian royalty here. He basically is treated as a king. And we know just from our popular culture of thinking of mummies and stuff that like this embalming really is a well-known thing that the Egyptians did. But 40 days, they worked on this thing for 40 days to preserve him, which is wild. But for 70 days, there's this mourning period there in Egypt. After this, Joseph goes to the household of Pharaoh in verse 4. He says, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There shall you bury me. Now therefore, let me please go up and bury my father, and then I will return." This request of Jacob to go out of Egypt up into Canaan is something that I think we should recognize this mirroring what happens in Exodus. When Moses comes and he says, these are God's people, Israel, let us go up out of Egypt and worship our God out of Egypt. And the Pharaoh says, no way am I doing that. I am not letting you go. Here, the Pharaoh responds positively. Here, the Pharaoh says yes. And I think you continue to see this contrast I mentioned last week between this Pharaoh and the later Pharaoh. This Pharaoh is blessing the people of God, and what's he getting in return? He is being blessed consistently. And the next Pharaoh is going to curse the people of God, and what does he get? He gets the curse. And that goes back to the promise of God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. I think you see that played out in these two Pharaohs. And this Pharaoh responds positively. It says, go up, bury your father as he made you swear. And so Joseph goes up, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And they went up with him, both chariots and horsemen, and it was a great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. Now, this is really significant that they go beyond the Jordan. If you just look at a map and how you would go from Egypt up into the land of Canaan, you don't go around to the east. You just waltz up into the south of Canaan. But what they do is they come up around the Jordan, and they come into this spot on the other side of the Jordan. And I think this is a foreshadowing of what is actually going to happen with the people of Israel. When they come out of the Exodus, they don't just waltz up into the south of Israel. They go to the other side of the Jordan, and God has them cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan. And that's exactly what happens here. Is they go to this other side of the Jordan, they mourn there, and then they cross into the land of Canaan where they are going to bury him. And I think that's a foreshadowing there as well of what is going to happen in the Exodus. Verse 12 says, thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. His sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Now the place that Jacob and Abraham and his wife and Isaac and his wife are buried is really significant, because this is the only place in the promised land, in the land of Canaan, this is the only place that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ever actually owned in the Bible. God gave this incredible promise that you will have the land of Canaan. Your descendants, this is your place. The only thing they ever owned was this cave at Machpelah where they would be buried. Other than that, they're wanderers. They're not necessarily tied to a particular spot. But this is the one place that they owned. And so Jacob insisting, when I die, I want to go there. I want to go be buried with Abraham and Isaac. I want to go be buried in this place that we own in the land of Canaan. I think that's expressing confidence in the promises of God. And it's pointing them, he is more tied to this covenant with God, that God is going to give me the land and God is going to bring me back up into Canaan. He is tied to that covenant and a confidence that is in that covenant. And Joseph and the sons see that, and Joseph ends up asking that the same thing be done for him, that when they come up out of Egypt, his bones would be taken to the land of Canaan where his father is. The other thing here is it is not mentioned where Rachel is here. Through this whole story, we've seen Jacob is very concerned about Rachel. He thinks about Rachel. And even at the end of chapter 49, it talks about Abraham is buried there with Sarah, his wife. Isaac is buried there with Rebekah, his wife. Rachel, he also says, and there I buried Leah, the wife that he didn't want in the first place. Rachel is buried elsewhere. And he doesn't go and say, I want to be buried with my wife Rachel. He says, I want to go be buried here with my fathers in this place in Canaan, because that is where God has promised our people to be. So he was even more tied to the covenant of God than he was in this relationship with his wife Rachel here at the end. So he is mourned, he is buried there, and you see this foreshadowing of the Exodus that's going to happen. Now, what happens in the end of Genesis chapter 50 points us back to this theme of the sovereignty of God that has run through all of this. But you see Joseph leaning on the sovereignty of God to show kindness to his brothers. So verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave us this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph's brothers, we have no record here of Jacob actually saying that. So whether he did or not, I don't know. But I think that they are still showing a little dishonesty here. They're trying to save their own skin. They invoke their father, first of all. They say, oh, your dad said this. Don't hurt us. They also invoke the name of God. They say, we are servants of the God of your father. So they're trying to pull out all the stops. How can we keep Joseph from killing us now that our father is gone? But Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold your servants. Remember, how did the Joseph narrative start? You're going to bow before me. This is Joseph's dream. And here they come bowing before him once again. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So again, we talked about this a lot, but we talked about it back in 45 whenever he first comes to them. But Joseph humbles himself under the sovereign plan of God. And because of that, he is able to show grace to his brothers. He is showing that it is not his place to carry out this justice on them. It is not his place to make them pay for what they did, because he recognizes all of this was God's doing. This is what God was working. And I've talked about in the past, we learned from this. If we can recognize the sovereign plan of God, that has practical implications for our lives. In how do we treat other people? How do we treat people who have treated us wrongly? How do we treat people who we may not want to respond to in the best way? If we have a strong understanding that even if they meant it for evil, God meant it for good, that gives us the ability to show grace to others and to show mercy. And not only does he show mercy in not destroying them, but he goes on and he says, I will provide for you and your little ones. He goes and he shows this bountiful provision from God through Joseph. So it's just once again reiterating that theme of the sovereignty of God running through the story of Joseph. And Joseph then leans on that sovereignty to show kindness to his brothers. So just as we wrap this up towards the end of this, we see more anticipation of the Exodus. One thing I wanted to say in that is pointing to Romans 8 in the book of Romans, where Dr. York is preaching right now. God working all things together for the good of those who love him is very much tied to that. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. God is working all of those things together for those who love him. The purpose was to save the lives of many people. So what you see in verses 22 to 26, let's read this and then wrap up the Joseph narrative. It says, so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So again, there is this anticipation of the Exodus. God is going to do this. God will bring you up out of the land of Egypt. God is going to make good on his promises that you will own the land of Canaan. And then Joseph dies here at the end. And I've really built up Joseph throughout this class. Like Joseph is this, he is a big fulfillment of lots of things in the book of Genesis. You see through Joseph here, the people of God are fruitful and multiply because of Joseph. That is a theme that started at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, and you see it tied up with a bit of a conclusion here at the end through Joseph. You see that in Joseph, there is kind of a royal descendant of the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see Joseph ruling over Egypt. He is very much a fulfillment, at least a partial fulfillment of that promise to them. And you see that through Joseph, all the nations are blessed, because you see all the nations coming in and buying food in the midst of famine. So you see this partial fulfillment happening in Joseph. And so Joseph really is a conclusion that is purposely put there by Moses writing the book of Genesis. But we also know that he's not the final conclusion, because the book of Genesis starts with this glorious creation of all of the universe to the glory of God, and it ends in a box in Egypt. It ends in a coffin with a guy that was really great and brought about all this really cool stuff, but ultimately he died. And ultimately he couldn't save his people in the end. He didn't truly bring about the fulfillment of all of these things forever, for all of eternity. And ultimately the promise of God extends past the life of Joseph, who is a fitting conclusion for the book of Genesis, but he is not a fitting conclusion for the Bible. And the promises of God are going to come through the tribe of Judah, who is kind of this side piece that is significant in the Joseph narrative, but ultimately becomes much more significant later on as they come up out of Egypt. And I think it's important for us to recognize that through all of this, through Joseph, God was doing this great stuff, but God is sovereignly working a much bigger plan. And that plan is for the salvation, not just of the people of Israel, but God was working a salvation for all of the sons of Adam and Eve. God was working a salvation for people of all nations, that all the nations of the world could be blessed. And that ultimately is going to come through Jesus. And it's much, much later, and it's through a really complicated history of Israel succeeding and failing and succeeding and failing and all of this difficult struggle. But ultimately, we look forward in this to Jesus, who is the true royal descendant who will reign forever and ever on a throne that will never be defeated. And it is through him that all of the nations are ultimately going to be blessed. So while I do argue that we look at Joseph as the conclusion of Genesis and that he is really significant to us, ultimately I think he is just a tiny little shadow of what was to come. And that ultimately this Joseph, who was mistreated by his brothers and who through his suffering ended up being the salvation of his brothers, he's just a little shadow of the one through whose suffering true salvation for eternity would come. So as you go back and hopefully read through the Joseph narrative again and see all the little connections that we've made, I hope that you also look forward from that and rejoice in the salvation that Jesus has brought through the sovereign plan of God for us.